I'm Russ Altman, and today Professor Roseanna Zia explains the science and significance of gels, suspensions, and glasses. Over 95% of biological fluids are neither solid, liquid, nor gas. Instead, they are in an alternative form that shares features of both solids and liquids. Remarkably, the physics of these materials is not really well understood, and therein lies a great opportunity for discovery and engineering. We are taught in grammar school that matter is usually in one of three forms: solid, liquid, and gas. Often water is used as the example. Solid water is ice. Solids have a fixed shape. Liquid water is, well, it's water. It flows and it takes the shape of its container. Gaseous water is steam. It also takes the shape of its container, but it fills it up and it doesn't quite flow so much. The physical principles behind these substances is pretty well worked out, and we can predict the behavior of many materials in these different states. But there are other important states and forms: gels, suspensions, glasses. They are ubiquitous in our lives. Toothpaste, hair product, paint, windows. Remarkably, the physics of these materials is much less well understood, despite their huge economic impact. Roseanna Zia is a professor of chemical engineering and mechanical engineering at Stanford University. Her lab studies a particular kind of substance called a colloid, where little particles that are bigger than atoms but smaller than cells are suspended in a fluid. It creates a gel-like substance, and we call those colloids. The key thing is that the interior of many cells, in fact all cells, is organized as a colloid. And so understanding the physics of colloid is critical for understanding the physics of how cells work. Roseanna will start out explaining what is special about gels, suspensions, and glasses. Later, she will correct my mischaracterization of why my friend has wavy windows in the front of her house. Finally, she will also describe a physical phenomenon called Brownian motion.
Sure. I like to thinking about first what they are not. They're not liquids and they're not solids. We're all familiar with traditional simple liquids like water and honey, which just deform continuously. If I dump out my coffee on the table, it keeps flowing. It can't hold its own shape. In the opposite end of the spectrum is an elastic solid like my pen. It can hold its own shape and it'll recover after I bend it a little bit. Gels, glasses, and colloidal suspensions are actually viscoelastic, meaning they can display both these kinds of behaviors, like toothpaste or hair gel. When you squeeze it out of the tube, it flows like a liquid, then it can sit like a solid on your hand if you turn it upside down, and then it'll liquefy again. And the reason for this is that these materials have some sort of embedded structure that we can't see with the naked eye. And that gives them both liquid-like and solid-like characteristics that make them super useful.
Great. So that's super helpful. And is it important for us to understand the differences between a gel, suspension, and a glass, or should we consider them pretty much synonyms?
I think that they're quite different, at least from a colloid scientist perspective. We can think about them as,
that's what we're talking about today.
All right, so we should think about them as holding different positions on a phase diagram. A lot of people learned about different types of phases at some point in school, like a gas or a liquid or a solid, like water. It can be a vapor, a steam. You can cool it and it'll turn into liquid, and you cool it more and turn it to ice. And so there's a lot that can be learned about that model or that metaphor for colloidal suspensions and complex fluids. Gels are things that they're often called yield stress fluids, meaning it's pretty easy to liquefy them.
Okay.
Glasses are hard materials, like the glasses that we're familiar with.
Right.
And if you work pretty hard, you can make them flow, but they're essentially solids in many ways.
It's funny that you say that, because I was recently visiting a friend who has a super old house, and you could see in there, they have a huge window in the front of their super old living room, and you could see that over 120 years, the glass had slowly kind of almost flowed downwards, and you could see very clear distortions, but they were quite beautiful, actually. And it reminded me that that in third grade I learned that glass was actually a fluid, and I could almost, not a fluid, it had fluid-like properties, and you could see this right in front of you in this very old window.
Oh, you can, and you're right, and there's a misconception there I want to clear up. I love physics misconceptions.
Good.
So You're totally right that when you said it flowed, because glass is a liquid. It's an extremely high viscosity liquid. In fact, in Australia, there's an experiment that's been going on over 100 years on this material called bitumen that will drop one drop of this material every few decades or so. It's
Huh.
ultra high viscosity. Glass is thought by many people to be ultra high viscosity, but it takes thousands of years to flow. Now, it is widely thought that these ripples in house glass are due
Yes.
to it flowing, and I think
Oh
the most
no.
important, it's not, it's the techniques to forming these materials in the past were not the same way that they are today. They would actually flow before they were done solidifying originally. But I still think this is useful because it gets people to realize that things flow. In fact, in the rheological world, there's a Greek phrase, "pantarei," means stuff flows,
Huh.
and everything flows eventually. Even the glaciers flow.
So, okay, great. So now we have a rough idea of this really interesting kind of hybrid, right in between solids and fluids that you've just described. Why are they so critical, and and what are the frontiers that your research is trying to address in these substances?
Yeah, they're one of the reasons that they're critical is that they're everywhere. I would say that they're probably, I mean, obviously our oceans it's the ocean water is the most plentiful subfluid on Earth. But with other materials and fluids we're familiar with, they're really dominated by complex fluids. They're almost all of the household products we use. They're all the biological fluids in our bodies. It's what our cells are filled with. All of the drilling fluids. I mean, they're just ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So that's why it's really important to understand them. And these properties that they have are also essential to things like sustainability and recyclability and so on. And a lot of people think that and I agree, a lot of the future of science resides at this small scale and how what governs the flow of these materials.
Yeah, so in reviewing some of your work, I was struck that we think of physics, especially physics of fluid flow and the physics of solids that move like heavenly bodies and stuff. We think of that as all kind of resolved, but it became very clear looking at your work that even some of the basic physics and our understanding and ability to predict the behavior of these gels, colloids, suspensions is not perfectly worked out. So that was a surprise to me, and I guess the first question is, why has it taken so long for us to figure this out? And it must be hard, because if it was easy, it'd be over.
That's right. Yeah, the things that are still huge open questions. One of the principal ones really concerns the glass transition. In fact, a Nobel Prize speech in the 1990s would address what do you think are some of the grand challenges of soft matter, condensed matter science, and understanding the glass transition was one of them.
Can you define glass transition for me?
Sure. Sometimes when we know that when we cool materials, they go from a liquid state to a solid state. We see this around us in the wintertime, depending on where you live, and it's leverage for all sorts of materials, glass forming, and so on. And in many cases, when you cool something, it has a very well-defined crystalline state. The molecular particles or the constituents really like to find periodic order because it minimizes the free energy when it cools. There are cases, however, when you cool such a material that it seems to solidify, yet retains the amorphous structure inside of a liquid.
So it's not a regular array of very ordered things like cars in a rental car parking lot, but they're more parked in random ways.
That's right. It's like maybe comparing a really well-defined distribution of particles on a grid
Yes.
to, say, O'Hare,
Right.
and,
Gotcha.
which people distribute throughout and the idea is that somehow it seems to freeze in this non-equilibrium structure. And what is such a great challenge about this is we have all this beautiful theory to describe the transition from the vapor state to the liquid state to the crystalline state. And these were all important achievements in the arc of science. Yet there's a stark fault in all of that theory we have, which is how do we predict this transition where the material seems to avoid crystallization
Right.
for very long, sometimes maybe even infinite periods of time. And just from a heuristic or a fundamental point of view, it's a big fault in our ability to describe a really ubiquitous transition that we see.
So it's a frontier. It's literally a frontier of physics, creating the equations and the models for how to. Because I guess when you look at some substance, you'd like to know, if I cool this down, is it going to turn into a hard crystalline thing, or is it going to turn into a colloid? And if you don't have the ability to make that prediction, I can imagine many industries would not be happy. It would introduce randomness to their processes that they probably don't like. I guess that leads me to the question of what are the industries that care most? And you kind of answered this before, but I guess to review, which industries care most about getting this physics well understood?
Well, it's been a traditionally long-standing question of importance in glasses, for example, in the coatings industry, people who make paints and sealers and car paints and any sort of coating that has to dry. When the fluid evaporates off, it leaves a solid. And if you don't get the right rearrangement of these microscopic particles, when that happens, it can lead to cracking, which can lead to all sorts of negative consequences in the performance of these materials. But a frontier that I'm really interested in is there's a clear understanding now that there are transitions to glassy states and things like bacteria that promote their ability to survive starvation conditions and can also prevent proteins and other things from falling apart. There are other words for it used in the biology literature, but basically they break down.
Yes, and I definitely want to get to that. But before that, let me ask. Like any discipline, I'm sure that there are theoretical, like mathematics and computational approaches, and as well as experimental approaches. And I'm wondering, on the experimental side, we can get to the computational side in a minute. How do you measure something to actually tell that it's one of these, that it's one of these phases that you're interested in? So, for example, you just said that a bacteria might have a transition under certain circumstances into a gel or a glass-like state. How do you make measurements on these tiny little organisms to tell what their state is?
So I'll answer that with the traditional measurements. Now, this is a theorist answering your question. I know what gets measured. There are things that are very quantifiable that tell you whether or not you have a liquid or a glass or a crystal. There are measurements of structure. There are certain things that tell us crystallinity or degree, how much of the material has crystalline order. There are very well-defined ways to measure these things. And then viscosity. So as something starts to vitrify, it gets extremely viscous. And so one can decide whether you have order or not, and whether something has solid-like character or not. And combined, those can tell you whether you have a crystal or a glass. Now, if you're trying to measure these things in really tiny systems, it can be quite difficult to measure these in live cells.
Right.
And some of the studies that I have seen measure things like they put in a tracer particle and they watch it wiggle around and diffuse around the cell. When you start to, when something is nice and liquid, then a tracer particle that glows, you can see it sort of sample the entire cell.
Because it's freely moving within the liquid.
It's freely moving. It's able to, it might have to wiggle past some dense areas and some loose areas here and there. But when things start to vitrify or even form a gel, it can get localized in a pocket, and that can be imaged, and you can see how long it gets stuck there. And then eventually it might escape and go to another pocket. Well, eventually that thing might get stuck there and stay forever, and people infer that a glassy state has emerged.
Oh, this is great. I mean, that really makes perfect sense to me, is that the behavior of a little tiny particle. Now, just out of curiosity, what happens in the crystalline state? Do they never even get in because things are packed so well that it's hard for that particle to get in, or does it have a certain behavior in solid or crystal conditions?
You'll see a similar trapping if things get into a crystalline condition. I mean, things get very immobile is a way. And you can think about it like if you get on a subway car, at rush hour, for example. If you get in there and there's not too many people on, you can wiggle around. But when everybody really jam packs in there, you're not going anywhere.
So I can't help, because of this example that you just gave, when I looked at some of the papers you've written, Brownian motion came up a ton, and now I can see its relationship because, but maybe it would be useful for you to define for me Brownian motion and the role it plays in these theoretical constructs that you work on for gels and suspensions.
Brownian motion is probably my favorite topic to ever
I'm
talk
glad I
about.
asked. Perfect.
So, Brownian motion is what happens when you place a particle in a liquid, and that particle is small enough that it actually sees the surrounding water molecules as individuals. So, if you were to go into a swimming pool, you don't really experience this other than if you go to the bottom of the pool, you feel some pressure in your ears, for example. But if you wanted to sort of visualize this, picture that I recently described this to somebody as though maybe you were in the worst dodgeball game ever of your life. And if you were to shrink yourself down to, say, the size of being inside the cell, then all the dodgeballs, the basketballs coming at your head are water molecules. And it would make
This
you
is a
jiggle
traumatic
around.
memory for many, many people that I know. So that
Sorry.
you've really hit a nerve with the dodgeball analogy.
So you get battered around, and the thing is these things come from everywhere. And
Right.
so as soon as you get a kick, you think I'm going this way, but then you get 10,000 other kicks from these molecules all around you, and eventually you just jitter around and you undergo what's called a random walk. And so you move, and over time, you'll explore an ever larger space, but on average, you don't go anywhere, meaning you don't have a preferred direction.
This 100% describes most games of dodgeball that I've ever. I'm just really struck by this analogy. I'm sorry. But yes, so you're jittering around. You might get a bigger and bigger radius, but basically there's no purpose. There's no purpose to your movement in terms of
That's right. And
reaching
it
a
can be
goal.
very useful because objects inside biological cells, for example, can then go around and explore the entire cell. And this is powered simply by the thermal energy of the surrounding molecules. It's sort of like, even a blind dog finds a bone once in a
Right.
way,
Right.
right? It can find its way. Now, there are other things that these molecules can be endowed with that actually help them find the locations they're supposed to find, but that's a separate subject.
So why is it called Brownian motion?
Oh, favorite story ever. So I'll take a minute and
Please.
describe it to you. There was a botanist in the early 1800s named Robert Brown who was getting famous because of his ability to build superior microscopes. And at that time, there was, a contemporaneous thought held that if we could just build more and more powerful microscopes, then eventually we would be able to find that particle that endows us with life itself. That would tell us why are we and pollen and plants different from rocks. So Brown was building this great microscope, and one day he popped open some pollen sacs. Pollen was known to convey life, and popped those open to look at some grains. And what he saw when he looked through his lens astounded him. He saw all these particles dancing around with no obvious form of nothing driving them. And he said, "Aha, I
Uh,
found it, the God particle. I'm going to be famous." And he knew, however, he was a good experimentalist. And he said, if this is life, then I know how to kill pollen with heat. And when I do this, they'll stop moving. So he did, but they didn't. They
they
just
kept
kept on
moving.
wiggling. That's right. And he was like, okay. So he ground up coal and I think arsenic. And Mark Haw provides a really nice review of this stuff in his book, The Middle World. And so what he concluded was he started using ever larger particles in this experiment. And he found, you know what, life doesn't matter at all in this motion, only small size. And I think he did the bravest thing possible. He wrote a paper and he said, I don't know what it is, but I know what it isn't. And there was a
Huh.
lot of misinterpretation for decades until the early 1900s when the idea of whether or not matter is made up of atoms was a huge debate. And Einstein, who actually claimed not to have known about Brown's experiments, did a thought experiment where he said, if matter is made of atoms and molecules, then in the liquid state, they must be mobile, but their trajectories are random. So if I could place a small particle in a liquid, it should follow all of those random trajectories.
Huh.
And random walks cause diffusion, and people already knew the mathematics of diffusion. And so he said, I propose that Brownian motion is evidence of the existence of the atom.
Wow.
And that was Einstein's theory of Brownian motion. Of course, the experimentalist got the Nobel Prize for it. Jean-Baptiste Perrin, in his PhD work and subsequent work, measured it and did a few other experiments and showed that indeed matter is made up of atoms and molecules.
This is The Future of Everything with Russ Altman. More with Roseanna Zia on SiriusXM Business Radio, Channel 132. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, and I'm speaking with Professor Roseanna Zia of Stanford University about gels and colloids. In this segment, Roseanna describes how the physics of colloids is critical for understanding life. It turns out that cells are not really just bags of water with molecules floating around in them, but are tightly packed and are much more accurately described as colloids. This has implications for diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, and also for how basic cellular machinery works.
Sure, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, and I always start with a caveat. I'm not a biologist.
That gives you
However,
license to say pretty much anything you want now.
they're usually pretty forgiving with me. So Brown wasn't entirely wrong, even though Brownian motion wasn't evidence of the fundamental life force that he visualized. It's central to almost everything that goes on with life, because the most fundamental place that sort of life starts is at the cellular level and smaller. And this is where the physics of fluid motion and particle motion really change and becomes Brownian. And one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is how colloidal scale physics instantiate life, colloids being these microscopically small particles suspended in liquids. So that's my area of research.
Okay.
Is when we talk about gels, glasses, and so on, it's not these molecular polymeric blends, it's individual particles suspended in liquids. This is sort of definitional of what the inside of a cell is. It's
Yes.
a sac of fluid with biochemical macromolecules in them. I would say that something that's very interesting is there's been sort of a parallel arc of inquiry since Brown's time, where one arc was going along with physics up through Einstein and Batchelor and others that think about the physics of suspensions, and another arc of inquiry that went through genetics and inheritance and DNA-centric, sort of the central dogma.
Right.
And I think we're finding in the last decade or more that this arc of inquiry is starting to come back together, where people are recognizing that physics inside cells is important in regulating and determining their behavior and misbehavior as chemistry is.
Yes, I've been very struck, as you know, I do some biological work myself, that sometimes biologists look for explicit control mechanisms, explicit biological mechanisms to do things where they don't have to, because the physics actually takes care of it. And so they say, well, how do we get something from A to B? And they think that the cell is doing it in a very intentional way. And then a physicist might come along and say, no, it'll get from A to B on its own. You don't have to create a mechanism for that to happen. So first of all, how should we think about cells? Because, many of us who take biology in high school, you said it's like a fluid bag with things in it. But what we don't have a feel for is how packed it is. Should I think of a cell as like a fish bowl where there's like a fish here and a fish there and they're moving around? Or should I think of it as very densely packed and it would be very difficult for a fish to move around?
More toward the latter. I tend to think of it like if I had to shrink myself down and go inside a cell, it'd be like a cross between a rave and O'Hare Airport.
Okay.
I mean, just madness. And it would be like running through O'Hare Airport and you have a blindfold on and earplugs in and you're running around and every time you get to your gate, they change the gate.
Yes.
And you can't hear anything. And somehow you manage to run past the right gate and some attractive force starts to pull you over there. But other than that, it's complete and total madness, it seems like.
Okay, so it is a very packed. So with your physical background and your kind of theoretical understanding of these gels and suspensions and colloids, how do you approach biology? It's actually we're at a great moment to talk with you, because it sounds like you're not calling yourself a biologist yet. You may someday. What is your approach to even figuring out what are the right questions to ask about cells and how they relate to the physics that you care about?
And I think the answer to this is the future of one of the futures or frontiers of physics and biology and chemical engineering, which is collaboration between colloid scientists, engineers, and biologists. One of my favorite things about working at Stanford University is my ability to collaborate with other scientists, such as Dan Yaros in the School of Medicine, and Manthur Abu-Ramallah in chemical engineering, and Drew Endy in bioengineering. So the idea is that there are behaviors in biological cells that require colloid physics to explain them. And only by working closely and with other scientists who work on cell problems can we identify these. Some examples include things that are really emergent, such as the gels in my work caught the attention of Dan Yaros and his group They studied neurodegenerative disease and the implication of things called prions that seem to be present in structures beyond the sort of liquid-liquid phase separation that's really dominated biophysics in the last decade. We believe there's a whole zoo of phases inside cells beyond just these liquid compartments, which was a huge discovery. But actually, we believe that's just a tiny part of the phase diagram. And that actually this physical process of the formation of these gels at the mesoscopic scale is what leads to the stability of these epigenetic diseases and disease inheritance.
So you're saying that the physics that results from the creation of certain molecules inside the cell might actually be causing the disease?
Yes, that's right. And we think that also holds the key to some of their treatment.
Right, because I was just going to say, if you understand what's causing it, then the same theoretical basis that you have for the formation of these abnormal, I think you called them phases, that might tell you how to disrupt such a phase and get the cell back to the packed state that it likes to be in.
We already believe that's true and already have experiments and simulations that suggest that. And it's actually quite interesting because this could then give us insights into things like aging and the progression of aging.
Yes. Are there other, so this is a great example. Are there other examples in biology of things that are driving your research toward the fundamental physics of what's going on?
One problem that we've been thinking about is translation of messenger RNA, mRNA. This is how proteins are synthesized inside cells through a sort of a little factory called the ribosome.
It's also been in the news because many of us have a vaccine in our arm that was based very closely related to messenger RNA.
That's right. And it's incredibly important. And this thing gets translated at fairly high speeds, and they synthesize proteins, which make almost all of the objects inside our cells that make things work or make them misbehave.
Yes.
And there was a recent Nobel Prize awarded to the sort of characterization of how the ribosome does this inside. There are these beautiful videos showing this process, but when you see these videos, they're cartoon videos, the background is like, it's black. It's like deep space.
Outer space, exactly.
Almost nothing is known how these particles get to the ribosome. And it's a combinatoric problem and a transport problem.
Yes.
And in my research group, in a collaboration with Drew Endy, what we have found is that actually the limiting step, the limiting process for this whole process is transport, physical diffusive transport.
This makes my mind go back to your analogy about being in O'Hare Airport. And if that messenger RNA is supposed to show up for some biological event, it may not get there linearly. It might not get right there in time.
And once it gets there, it's got to have all these other guys arrive to supply it. And I think in traditional views, people would have explained this from a purely kinetic standpoint, saying, oh, Brownian motion is just so fast, we don't have to worry about it. Just, we don't have to worry about any of this. And so we'll just explain it through kinetics. But that's sort of like using sort of the, let's say you're in New York City and you realize, wow, at 4 o'clock, all these people come up from the earth. They come out of the ground. And at 4:05, a bunch more go down. And at 4:15, some come over here, over there. We think there might be a network. And then you define kinetics, and it's really good at predicting, and you can actually make a schedule from that. But what I can help you understand is, it's actually, in addition to that, there are tunnels underground, and there are tracks, and there are individual cars, and they're connected, and this is how things break down.
Yes.
And so that physical space can help give a lot more background in that.
Thanks to Roseanna Zia. That was the future of fluid suspensions. You have been listening to The Future of Everything with Russ Altman on SiriusXM Business Radio, Channel 132.